Jeffrey, and this is the Passionate About OSS podcast. The purpose of the podcast is to shine a light on the brilliant minds of the OSS and telco industry, to describe some of their background, but also to share some of their knowledge, tips and techniques. Today's episode will take a look at leading network strategy and operations at a Tier 1 telco. Today's guest has spent her entire career in the telecoms industry. She's worked extensively with Australia and New Zealand's leading carriers, and the UK's for that matter. So Telstra, Telecom New Zealand, NBN, as well as Cable and Wireless and British Telecom. She's held executive positions leading nearly 500 network and operations people, and she's held EGM roles at NBN and was acting CTO, leading strategy for the entire tech stack. This experience makes her ideally suited to talk about the challenges of operations from a commercial, risk, technology, innovation and people perspective. She's now a leading broadband industry strategist, and I'm delighted to have her on the episode because she's a real global expert in the field of telco tech strategy. So welcome to Carolyn Phiddian.
Thank you very much, Ryan.
It's a pleasure to have you on. So Carolyn and I met relatively recently, so circa 2018, when Carolyn was in the CTO seat at NBN. With nearly 500 people under your direction, what sort of roles did this cover?
Well, the CTO group actually was a smaller group of about 30, in fact, because the CTO was looking at the very much future directions. The large workforce was when I was head of network operations, and that was the direct workforce. There was also a field workforce associated with that, which would have multiplied that number a few times. In the main, I have worked in engineering groups. So the CTO group was with NBN, of course, we have or had, I'm no longer with them, but we had a multi-technology mix. So that meant from a CTO perspective, it was really interesting because you were looking at the future, the evolving technologies of a whole range of different technologies that most people in most carriers would have only had one or two of. We have everything from satellites to HFC to optical to copper. So there was, and fixed wireless too. So we had the LTE based. So there was quite a range of technologies. And one of the things that helped give us was quite an interesting view of where convergence was going to be in long term, even in access networks, not in the core and cloud, but in the access networks themselves.
And a strategy across all of those, I guess there's nuances to all of those different technological challenges and identifying the optimum in certain situations as you're trying to connect different parts of Australia or different services or different customer categories.
Yeah, well, the NBN situation is quite interesting because we're trying to deliver the one product. So people got very hung up on the different technologies, but actually it was only one product, which is broadband. And so part of that, I always think it's a bit like the Sesame Street strategy, quite frankly. It's figuring out which one of these is not like the other ones and which ones are. So you're trying to kind of group either functions or features and understanding what's the simplest way to deliver those. So one of the challenges for NBN at a network layer was having all those different technologies meant you might duplicate everything 6 times, and then you would be able to, if you weren't careful, duplicate that all the way up the OSS stack a long way, which is just a high cost, high operational, complex architecture model. And so for me, the purpose of the strategy was to try and look for synergies and to try and force actually industry at times into better convergence around the way that the equipment was configured and talked to, as it were.
I guess the equivalency on top of disparate tech stacks.
Yeah, there's a certain amount of very specific kind of technology when you're talking about the way that signals travel over coaxial cable versus through optical fibre. But in the end, if it's the same product, surely you should be able to make that look more common, reasonably low down that stack, so that it's then a simpler business to operate and sell.
So we'll come back a little bit more into NBN and the role of leading operations a little bit later, but your OSS journey, I assume, goes back quite a bit further than that. Am I right in saying that your telco career started at Telstra, Australia's monopoly carrier at that time?
Yes. Well, it was actually Telecom Australia in the year that I joined, Brian. So it was pre-privatisation and pre-competition. So, in fact, included a typing pool in my first year of working as a graduate. I didn't get a computer on my desk till about second year. I started there. I had a wonderful graduate experience with the group that I was in. I was in customer radio, so access radio. And the work that we were doing there was delivering telephony services via point-to-point radio in Central Australia, or in really remote areas. So it was that outer end of the universal service obligation. And so I kind of, in my first year, had to fly to Adelaide, hop in a company four-wheel drive with some other engineers who are far more experienced. And then so I went through the desert and got onto the Indigenous lands, and it was called work, and they paid me travel allowance. I couldn't figure it out at the time. I thought that was just a bit too darn lucky for words.
Absolutely. So I guess you hadn't travelled so much, a little bit like myself. Work was really what took me out of the little comfort zone, out of my little 10-kilometre radius. So that would have been fascinating, seeing some of the outback of Australia and Indigenous communities and so forth. Yeah.
No, it was terrific. And I think, so I started with customer radio, but the thing about it, I guess, that was a really great fit for me was it was not about profit particularly. It was about delivering a service, and it was about delivering the best service that we could to the people who were the most remote, who, in essence, had the highest risk of being isolated if the equipment didn't work.
Yeah, such a valid point. And it was such a gold-plated network back in those days before privatisation as well. It was amazing engineering standards.
It was a brilliant network, yeah. And look, I think that the apocryphal story with Frank Blunt arrived into the business. He was brought in from America, brought in from, AT&T, and he sat down and he said, okay, who's the head of marketing? And everyone at the exco level looked around the table at each other and went, marketing? They were all engineers. That's right. Yeah, so there was quite a big culture shift that needed to happen, which I think was good for discovering customers and things like that, although you could suggest that maybe Telstra have lost the way now in that you cannot speak to a person if you want to change anything about your system. But, yeah, at the time it was a time of great excitement and great change. It was the beginning of mobiles, and the internet hadn't really taken off yet. So it was, although by the time I worked in Telstra as specialist engineer in MUX equipment and the first SDH systems, and also then building the first internet products as a project manager, I saw a lot of really, really interesting stuff happen and was able to really bring new technology. My particular interest is bringing new to the situation technology into a place. So when people haven't actually done it before, it's not an upgrade, it's not a gentle evolution. It was stuff that was new and making it work, because that's complex and tricky, because technology is all about people as well.
And Telstra would have been a fantastic petri dish for that at that time as well. There was still a heavy investment in the R&D labs and things like that as well.
Yep, yeah, it certainly was. I spent 6 months of rotation in the research labs, enough to realise that it wasn't my thing. I wanted more of an applied sense to get satisfaction. Everyone gets satisfaction. Some people at the research labs, they got tremendous satisfaction from developing an idea, whereas I got much more satisfaction from implementing something. But it didn't have to be immediate. For me, I moved to architecture because it was something that would have a long-term impact. Everyone sits somewhere in that continuum, I think, of where their sweet spot is at work and the things that really they like the most.
And how long in total did you spend at Telstra?
In the end, it was 14 years, and I left to go to live and work in the UK, and that was very much for my own refreshing and growth, because I think the way that I felt about it was I was starting to have replays in Telstra, and I was meeting all the new people all the time, and at one point I was getting impatient, too impatient with new people. How can you be, it's not appropriate. But I was thinking, no, they're not idiots. It's me that needs to go, So I decided that it was a good time in my life. And with my partner, we went to live in the UK. And that was really throwing me back on my own individual resources from being, executive and all that sort of stuff at Telstra, which I was. And it was, refreshing, scary and refreshing at the same time.
Yeah, and that role was really more of a consulting role from the outside looking into organisations like BT. Yep. And was there a major shift in the thinking? Was there a major difference between BT and Telstra as well in culture, technology and so on?
Well, look, that's a really interesting question because it's multifaceted to even attempt to approach an answer. Interesting things for me was with BT, it was very similar, but I was engaged in reviewing a voice and IP idea that they had in their Martlesham, which is their research lab. So that was familiar from that sort of interaction. I also consulted into Cable and Wireless, and that was implementing call center security on an interactive voice response platform where they'd sold that platform used to a bank. And the bank and said, oh, yes, and what about your security? And they went, oh, yeah, security. And so I ended up being engaged as a consultant to lead that for them. And that was just exactly the same. To get a telco product to market, you have to have all of the things that you always have to have. It has to have the functions that it delivers. You have to have it structured so that there's the marketing, there's all of the operational processes, of course, of activation, I used to call it in those days, but, for fill and assurance and billing. Billing's always a pain in the backside. But so I could interact with the people, the product managers and so forth in Cable and Wireless and say, well, where's the this and where's the that and what have you done for lawful interception and what's the regulatory requirements? And they went, oh, how do you know all this stuff? It's like, well, it's the same, So that was very similar. The differences were in the scale. There was a much, much bigger scale. In a bit of pretty unfortunate timing, the dot boom crashed, when I arrived in the UK. So it was a tighter time. So it was one of those leaner times in industry as well. So there was less going on. But it was a very enjoyable time. Everyone thought the internet would take over the world, which of course it did, but not at the speed that people had hoped. Telcos got massively overvalued and then they couldn't support it with revenues and then it went all gunk for 2-3 years.
Yeah. Interesting too that you raise lawful intercept and security and all of the OSS, BSS type workflows because I always feel like they are an afterthought for so many, at least having worked at Telstra, and I guess there's even the big checklist of all the things that you need to do that has to come front and centre before any handover or operational go live. But for many, that's really an afterthought, I find, on a lot of projects.
Yeah, it certainly can be, and it's always the things that catch you up. So I did spend a section in time in Telstra, which was in an area which was well ahead, I thought, because they created a product development process so that people actually understood all those things needed to be in place before you could make a new product go live. It's a real balance with that, though. I'm sure you could feel the same, Ryan. I mean, that was a product creation process, like the Book of Genesis. There was nothing, and then at the end there's a fully formed product with all of the things it needs. That's heavy duty. You don't always need to apply that. So one of the things that I really learned in my time in product development was tailoring to the need was really absolutely critical, but trying to take shortcuts never worked.
And one of the things that I found, having worked overseas and in many different corporate cultures, was just the benefit of seeing how different people do things and the ability to say, okay, I learnt this from this customer, or that was done badly here, and I try and avoid doing it that way. Did you also find that from your time at BT, Cable and Wireless, that it gave a different perspective on things than perhaps what you'd had at Telstra?
No, I think I experienced that more in New Zealand, where there was a lot more can do and no waste. There was a sort of, I kind of interpreted it as a quite a strong Celtic background. So there was, waste not, want not, that sort of stuff. And there was really things were done there on a smaller scale and also ways that were newer to me than in the UK. And also when I've worked across Asia, of course, there's been things where I'm going, that definitely won't work. And guess what? It can, so there's things you have to keep an open mind and make sure you're always looking at whether stuff actually does work rather than trying to predict too much in advance.
Yeah, interesting call out too about New Zealand, because one of the things I found is working with some of the smaller telcos, they have the smaller market, smaller revenues, and have to run more on the smell of an oily rag, and therefore they do some much more innovative things or perhaps much more efficient things. There's no room for the bureaucracy. They don't have the number of people that need to be informed. So I wonder whether it's also just the smaller size means less bureaucracy, less involvement of other people, and just more efficiency in getting things done too.
Yeah. The other thing I found though in New Zealand was you would never piss anyone off because you would work with them or need to have to work with them in close quarters. The industry was much smaller, so some of that led to silos that were really long-standing and very difficult to get across. So because the people matter so much, there are less, there are a lot less people. So that means your resilience as a business can be a little bit lessened as a result. Fantastic to get the middle people out. And I thought, in Australia, I was considered direct because I was Australian, and that's more a language thing than anything else. But in New Zealand, they take no prisoners. Like they're even more direct than Australians. So it's interesting seeing that part of how people interact at work and what's a norm and what isn't, and understanding the nuance of culture, even in 3 English-speaking countries.
Yeah, and all colonial countries too, so the same origins, I guess, and they would have even shared a lot of the telco knowledge, particularly Telstra and BT would have done a lot of sharing and working together on standards bodies and the like too.
Yeah, certainly when we did the original SGH stuff in Telstra, we took a lot of the BT sort of standards, and which became ITU standards, of course.
And so was it a journey from the UK to New Zealand, or had you done the trip back home to Melbourne in between that?
So, we came back home to Melbourne. It was one of those things, having been a couple of years in the UK, we needed to decide where we were going to live, because you either put roots down where you've moved to, or you decide to come back.
Parallel universe that you've left behind.
Yeah, the funny one where everyone thinks you are exactly the same as when you left, but you're not, because you've had 2 years of experience. But also it's hard to crack back in when you're home, because it takes a good 6 months for people to remember that you're actually here and get you into their standard routines. Yes. So I did that, and that's when I worked for about a year or so with the TPAMS project in Victorian Government, doing the all-government provisioning for data and telephony services. It was from there then I got the role with Alcatel. They had their transforming vendor relationships with Telecom New Zealand. So I didn't work for Telecom New Zealand. I worked for Alcatel as the outsourced engineering access platform lead for DSL. So that meant that every business case, access and transport it was, so it included the DWDM. And we had to make everything understandable to accountants, which is actually a good challenge for engineers, because we tend to think there's the way that we think the technology benefits are evident. And of course, you're always going to put in something better because it'll save you pain in the long term. But if you actually have to work through those arguments blow by blow with accountants, it's a good discipline. So it was a really good grounding in some of the basic consultancy skills as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that completely. And I'd like to touch on the Multimedia Victoria, the TPAMS that you talked about, because that was circa 2003 or 2004. And That TPAM structure has been quite amazing. It's just in the process of being overhauled now. So around about 16, 17 years later, I find it pretty astounding that a telco procurement framework can still be in place after that many years, especially considering the massive changes that we've undergone as an industry. It must have been quite a remarkable contract to still be valid, and must have been set up with a lot of flexibility in mind to have lasted through that long period.
Look, I don't think it was done with so much foresight as it seems to have had in retrospect, because it was about collective purchasing. So it was absolutely intended to help the smaller departments get a boost from some of the purchasing power of the larger departments, because the customer base within government, I did some of that, essentially account management for a period as well. Their needs are very specific and quite different from, Department of Justice, from what's one of the smaller ones, environment, say, like they've got really different needs. So the collective purchase, that was the drive, and therefore what it was getting back to my Sesame Street analogy. You wanted to put everything that was the same in the one bucket so it could be purchased at the best price from the approved providers. And so I think that's point one. And the other thing it was a maturing customer market for IP-based connectivity had matured enough that you could actually define it. So that meant that all of the IP tails, the things needed by the education department or health or whatever, that there was enough consistency in the way that people wanted those kind of connections, that I think it was perhaps the first whole state government collection of those sorts of things, of dedicated links or shared links, or, in the different orders of magnitude of capacity that you might want. I think it was partly the time that it was done, combined with the intent of getting this collective purchasing power to really work for the smaller departments as well as the larger ones.
So we touched a little bit on the flip over to Alcatel-Lucent. So by the time you'd done that, you'd already ticked the boxes of big telco, consulting and government. Moving across to the vendor SI land as Director of Solution Architecture at Alcatel-Lucent, can you tell us a little bit more about what your role entailed there, and maybe some of the exciting projects you had a chance to work on? You've touched on TNZ, but perhaps some others as well.
Yeah, sure. So for me, that was a really great time. I'd followed one of my great mentors, Warren Lemons. So he'd been my exec manager in a couple of things in Telstra. He moved to New Zealand. So partly I had a really strong leader, which always makes a big difference. But the Alcatel-Lucent stuff, as I said, was a much more of a consulting thing. The interesting thing for me about being in Alcatel at the time was I was in the solutions area, not in a product group. So I wasn't trying to push a box. And we had all of this subtlety around the solutions that we had, equipment that would be preferred as long as it met the needs of Telecom New Zealand. So we weren't actually selling the boxes, but we were kind of rewarded for selling boxes. So it was a really interesting thing. And one of the things that I've always, the greyness of that is I'm quite comfortable with. A lot of IT people and network people are I'm either selling the box or I'm not selling the box. It's like, no. The world is a little bit more textured than that, and you're kind of hoping for a win-win. And there would be no way I would have pushed an Alcatel box that was wrong and didn't meet the needs of the customer. So it's kind of one of those interesting things for a equipment provider, to have that kind of role in an equipment provider. That said, the thing that I really, really was fantastic about being in Alcatel and then Alcatel-Lucent, now Nokia, was the access to the research. It was like a mother lode. You do not get that in a carrier. Yeah, and it's in a carrier, it's all more spec, and it's a different point in the technology cycle often. But within that, and the people, that there's so much intellectual power in the people in all those different groups. Now they argued terribly most of the time. You didn't always get the best outcome because people were quite competitive intellectually, but it was really interesting, and I was never bored with the technology, and had access to people who could really talk very clearly about where things were headed and why. You still have to make your own mind up whether you think their opinion's right, but it was just fantastic from that perspective for me. And I really, after the TPAMS thing, which was buying essentially vanilla services that have popped out the other end of the carrier process, getting to the R&D with Alcatel was just, I was like, yep, I like emerging technology. I like new technology. I find that really interesting. That was wonderful from that perspective.
Yeah, and really focused on the customer outcome. I guess too, having that background in big telco and consulting prior to joining effectively a product company, it meant you were evaluating lots of different products to say, well, which was the best, and therefore getting the best for the outcome. Whereas perhaps somebody who'd spent all their life in that product company was perhaps more focused on just that particular brand or their particular products more so than the customer outcome.
Yeah, and look, it's a different cycle. Have you worked in one of those companies for a period of time, right?
Yeah, so I spent 18 months with Alcatel-Lucent as well, and saw a little bit of that. But I guess I'd had the external consulting perspective prior, and I also worked quite closely with another similar company to Alcatel-Lucent, and I found it staggering that they had a whole bunch of product lines and were very, very product-centric and had amazing technical knowledge about the products, but they had no group that could actually pull together a customer solution. So I came in as almost the outsider, having to bring together a whole bunch of different product lines. So as an external, I was put in charge of doing a bid management role for something that was probably worth $1 billion bid. And it just staggered me that they didn't really have that customer service type of delivery unit to look across all of their different product lines.
Yeah, from my perspective, that comes back a bit more to the fact that they live boom and bust.
Yeah.
So you get a big contract, it's boom, and you never have enough people, and there's like a mozza of work for people to handle. And then there's the attrition times. And so that's, solution teams are considered a luxury in those sorts of situations when they're just trying to keep the product line and its research going so that it'll win business in the future. So I found it a much more of a roller coaster compared with a carrier.
Yeah, fascinating insight. I'd never joined those dots together. The fact that I'd assumed that there would always be customer delivery type projects underway, and therefore there'd be the ongoing team and ongoing expertise. But I think you're right. They do tend to be big project and then a downturn, big project, downturn. Yeah, brilliant insight. So then with those boxes ticked, NBN came calling with a really senior role in mind for you. You able to touch a little bit about NBN, about where it was starting from and the ambitions of the formation of NBN and what you came in to do?
Yeah, sure. So NBN was initiated by an Act of Parliament and with a letter of expectations, which was to provide broadband to all of Australia. And not only that, it was technology specific originally, that said that at least 70% of the Australian population would have access to fibre to the premises. Now, in 2010, that was pretty out there. And then it was assumed that the more remote areas would be reached either via satellite or via a fixed wireless solution. So I was employee number 63, I think, at NBN.
Wow, very early. Yep.
Very early. So I started early in 2010. It had only been there for about 6 months, and it was, very much in borrowed old offices that had been vacated. And, it was really interesting. There was nothing there. There were no systems. There were none of those sorts of things. So I'm quite proud. I was the first person to hire someone part-time because the HR person said to me, "Oh, do we do part-time?" I said, "Yes, of course we do." And it was a mum with young kids who, you couldn't come to full-time work. I thought, oh, for God's sake, of course we do part-time. But anyway.
Writing the rules for HR
well, just writing the rules.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, of course we do. But anyway, so there was a lot of freedom, and it was a lot. The thing about it at the beginning was that everything you did had so much impact. It was chaotic. There was so much swirl, rumour. There were a whole bunch of people who came with their hands out saying, well, you've got all this money, you should give it to me because because I'm Australian, more or less, various versions of that. And we were given a challenge by the CEO at the time to go out to market to get a technology partner that would do the main part, so the core network essentially in the PON within 6 weeks, to go to tender and select someone within 6 weeks. And we had
that's
a really
fast
gun.
for such a big.
Yeah, of course it was. We had such a gun team that we all kind of looked at each other and went, yeah, I reckon we can do this. Because anyone who's been in a telco and has gone through, the business casing process for a new platform, like there's just so much sludge in the way, and it doesn't necessarily change what your choice is, but my goodness, it takes months, right? So we did. We had some particularly brilliant people. Stefan Keller-Tuberg is, R&D kind of quality person who joined NBN. And so we wrote the social equality into the network. So for me, I'm a network person, and, all apologies to you, OSS, BSS people here, because for me, the network is the product when you're talking a carrier. So you actually got the heart of the business in your hands to make sure that it does right. So what we needed to do was to create a broadband product that had some number of points of presence. At that point, it could have been anything from 1,700 to 2 in the country. So that put all sorts of interesting requirements and constraints into the core network. But also in the PON, we wanted to make sure that it was really equitable. Now, we took that very literally. I'm not quite sure why, but, it seemed like a good idea at the time. So we made sure that we had switching within the OLTs. That meant that someone who was trying to hog capacity on the PON, because a PON is shared between 32 homes, they wouldn't get more than their fair share of the capacity. So we had these very, very specific, deep technical requirements that the OLT would be able to manage that kind of traffic and not queue things up or put, create contention management in there that would distort everyone's right to the service that they ordered and paid for. So that meant that there was not too many suppliers that could give us that level of surety that their equipment would do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess doing a few procurements myself, I definitely find that you can go into a really, really deep dive of creating procurement type documents, but probably the more sensible way of doing it is taking the filtering approach, and it only has to take 5, 10, 20 questions at a top level to quickly whittle down a list of possible candidates from, say, 20, 50 down to 5, 2, 3, whatever it might be, to then do a deeper dive with them. So I imagine
Indeed.
with your short time frame, you would have had to have done quite a bit of that filtering process rather than creating swathes of RFP documentation.
Oh gosh, yeah, no, we didn't have time for that, but we did need to say that we needed to be able to manage it. So we did have to put in network management, element management, network management kind of capabilities. And the thing at that point, NBN was not operational. It had no workforce. So it had people that were going to be in charge of operations when we started operating anything. So there were so many unknowns that made it such a fantastically interesting thing to get something that would be future-proof enough to support whatever those decisions ended up being. Because we couldn't hurry the decisions on the points of presence. That was a whole industry consultation process and regulatory. That was regulated in the end to 121 points of interconnect. It was a really interesting process. So as part of that, the other thing that was my concern, having come actually from Alcatel-Lucent into NBN, it was the depth of technical skill, really understanding the depth of skill that's needed to architect network equipment and design it and configure it. There's not people walking the streets of Melbourne who just know how to do that. So as part of that RFP process, I did lead the concept of what I called a joint engineering partner, and it took me a while to figure out I didn't need to call it a joint and a partner, but anyway, which was to get access to that deep technical skill, because everyone in Australia wanted it to be successful. All of the suppliers did, and make sure that we got the right technical depth of expertise to actually deliver the substance that would need to come through for that process of architecture through to configuration, to config files and golden configs and that sort of stuff. And there was a second point that I knew on that also from my experience in terms of the level of maturity of solutions delivery in an equipment provider, is that you cannot outsource your risk. So I said, we want people, not outcomes, because they all said, oh no, if you contract to outcome, we'll be absolutely responsible for what gets delivered. And it's like, no, I don't want that. We needed to have people that could deliver in partnership, and we worked our backsides off absolutely in those first years to get it to be brought live. But we needed people to contribute to the deliverables that we were defining, because we knew we were accountable. We were going to be accountable for delivering the product to the Australian people. So that was a really big decision. It had long-term impacts around then making sure that we had enough technical expertise within the carrier, which is brand new at the time, because there were all people saying, oh, well, why don't you outsource it to, X, Y, or Z technology company or carrier? It's like, no. We needed to create that business with enough technical ability for it to be able to control its destiny. Yeah. And that's probably one where I think I feel quite strongly about that. People say outsourcing, is fine and you can outsource your risk. You never can.
Yeah, you can't outsource that ultimate level of accountability for the way that the organisation runs, and those key decisions that you are making have a vital, provides its footprints all over the future operations of the business.
Totally does. And for me, again, it's that network is the product, is the business. If you know how that runs and you know how to improve it and expand it and, what kind of scalability and single points of failure and all those sorts of things and what that actually means in terms of your availability and what you can deliver, then you will be in charge of your own business. You can upgrade technology. You can create efficiencies in processes. You can do process re-engineering even. But as long as you know enough about what it is that you are operating, then that leaves you with that ability to adapt in future.
But certainly the expertise really plays a big part in that statement too, because really NBN being the first real FTTP in Australia meant that you couldn't even source that exact same skill sets, knowledge, expertise just from the Telstras and Optuses and the existing telcos, because yes, they'd had a lot of fibre experience and experiences building networks and everything that comes with that. But the unique aspect of having experience actually building large-scale GPON networks would have had to have come from suppliers as well.
Yeah, and we made some very big decisions early on around the type of fibre. So we thought, well, look, let's buy good fibre. This is very much Tony Cross, who is my manager. But we went for ribbon-based fibre as opposed to stranded. And so every single decision in the external plant has massive commercial impact for a business. So the splicing of ribbons, so ribbons are 12 fibres in a little line, and you do one splice for 12 fibres. Now, if you're doing a fibre-rich network, that makes sense. If you're only doing a bit of a fibre here and a bit of fibre there, just having the fibres, like the copper cables, when they all spray out like, hair in every direction, that's okay to have stranded in there. But if you really are you have lots of fibre, you can have lots of connections, we save billions of dollars of build through using that technology. Now, that was not easily accepted by the industry because it was not what they were used to.
And the people all the splicing machines are based on a single splice at a time, and so there was retooling for all that.
That's right. So there were a lot of arguments and a lot of opinions around all of that. So we did take that opportunity to set what I think is still a very sound fibre access kind of architecture and set of technologies that is, in 5 years' time, everyone will say, well, we've always done it that way here. It just becomes what we do.
Standard. Yeah. And so how much of what you learn at Telstra, BT, Alcatel-Lucent was really applicable for this brave new world of NBN?
Yeah, NBN brought across some really interesting skill sets. So everything was applicable. And it was really interesting because the mood that we had, we wanted proper relationships with suppliers. We didn't want the beat them down, kick them in the dirt type stuff that we'd seen. So what we did was, let's say, try and deliberately not recreate the mistakes of the past. So we were going to be, because we had an incredible purchasing power as NBN, it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to say, okay, I learned all these things, and there were things about that were great, things about that were terrible. Let's try and do it all great. Now, of course, it never works out that way, and I haven't gone anywhere near the political interference vector that then happened with NBN. But at the time, it was, at that original point in time, it was such a wonderful place to be. It was the chance to try and stop other people suffering the way that you'd suffered in other companies and countries and situations, by trying to do best practice. And we really did try that.
Well, one of the things I found really an interesting frame of reference perhaps was when NBN was first starting out, that a lot of the people who were coming to the organisation had come from existing telcos, where because there was a lot of existing infrastructure, it was more of a run mindset as opposed to a build mindset. And one of the things that I thought was going to be challenging for NBN with all of that run mindset as the resources building the company, that it might run the risk of not being able to bridge the gap so it readily to becoming a build mindset company. Now, NBN 10 years on from that is now turning into a run company now, but it's 10 years of build that it's gone through, and a very different mindset between build and run.
I agree with you there, yeah.
In that initial GM role as fibre access network engineering, you've already talked about the importance of network and that you're a network person. Did network management and OSS BSS play a big part of your thinking in that time as the GM?
Yeah, I mean, we were very close with originally the CTO was CTO of all of the IT and network at the time, so that was Gary McLaren. So we were working really, really closely together. I had, through my product development experience, a very, very clear appreciation of the configuration required in activation and fulfillment, and certainly from a network availability and performance perspective, the network assurance is something that I always, I had quite a strong what I call intellectual and emotional affinity with. Service assurance is one that is sort of more the customer call center, that sort of aspect of things. Probably less so. We were developing a wholesale product, not a retail product. And so we had to keep making sure that we weren't over-finessing things. But in the end, you ended up having to have really most of the same things that you would have always needed for a retail product. They're not that different in the end. You just got a lot less customers if it's a wholesale product.
But you've certainly got awareness of the end customers as well beyond your reach. Yeah. So very much has to be engineered for them, not just
absolutely
for the retail service providers.
Yeah, look, and I don't know how many of your listeners have had that issue of being wholesale and who's your customer when you're wholesale. I know that our friends in Chorus in New Zealand had the same sort of issue, argy-bargying about who their customer is. And whether it's your end customer, or if you call them an end customer, does that mean that they're less important than your other customers? And, you have all that. My personal landing for that, and these are pendulum swings, and eventually, they settle into some kind of steady state. And they'll get changed anyway, going from time to time in any of these wholesale providers. But if you provide an excellent service to the people who actually use the service, then your customers will be fine. Right, they're not going to get in the way if you deliver fantastic service to every home. So for me, the focus was on the end-to-end service delivery, and from a customer perspective, I'm not a marketing or product marketing person, so I hadn't had to hammer out service level agreements and contracts and so forth. So that's not my gig, but making sure that everyone delivers that fabulous service to the home or the premises. that to me that's where the custom is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but then your next role as EGM of network operations would have definitely dragged you deeper into the OSS and BSS fold.
Most definitely. It was really interesting for me because, as I've said before, I see the network as the product and the basis for the company. In operations, I was instantly surrounded by people who saw it the other way. They see the OSS as the business. Everything about the actual business is in that their window is via the OSS BSS. So that was actually an interesting challenge for me to flip my head around and see it from more an operational perspective as opposed to a functional perspective. And I also had the joy and delight at the time of being responsible for getting operations ready for fibre to the node, which had happened through a change of government and a change of statement of expectations and direction, and had enormous urgency around it. Yet the operations group I entered was one that said, we're doing fibre to the prem. So they were just not ready. Basically no way they could have been, really, because it was a very quick turn required. I at least had significant fibre to the node experience, but there was no operational workforce for it. So it was a very, that was certainly the most high pressure time in my time at NBN, that's for sure. Everything was on fire.
Yeah, absolutely.
At once.
Well, and it was such a rapid flick too, but I guess too that you'd spent all of that time. So I look at it in terms of that operational handover is preceded by an operational readiness checklist, and that checklist usually comprises hundreds and hundreds of items from people, process and technology, and you'd spent all of the time building up the outcomes for that checklist to have been a FTTP. Suddenly also you have to develop all of those things again for FTTN, and such a massive amount of additional work to be done.
Yeah. It was a multiplication of work that we couldn't have people quickly enough to support, and was still quite immature as an operational business at that stage. It'd only been operational for, a few months.
Yeah, so effectively it's still a startup.
That's right.
Multi-thousand people startup.
We didn't have the maturity, we didn't have a huge amount of maturity in change management and business continuity, although I did run a couple of crisis management exercises, which was that was really interesting to actually go through that. So it brought to me the need for that level of structure in operations, and that very much it comes from more of a military mindset than I'd ever come at Telco, which was from an engineering mindset.
I see it as a command and control, which has definite overlaps with that sort of military mindset.
Yeah.
And interesting too that you talked a little bit earlier about the OSS or the operations people seeing OSS as the business and network people seeing network as the product. And I really see, again, I've got incredible blinkers on, but I really see OSS BSS as the connector between customer and network. So network is the resource that you sell, but the OSS and BSS parts connect customer to that product and also provide an insurance policy for that product as well. So speaking of which, I'd love to get your perspective. So as AGM and then acting CTO, I'd love to get your perspective of what OSS and BSS is. So the role it plays for a telco. So is it as the insurance policy? Is it the competitive advantage, etc.? So more of that business hat on what you see OSS as being.
Look, I think your description of it is really apt in terms of being the connector. It's not the end in itself, and I think that sometimes within telcos where people have a role where their work is going to be very affected by the latest version of the OSS and what features there are, that they sort of start to replace. They don't see the OSS as the connector either. They see it as actually the end in itself. So I think that where I've kind of come to, and it's really interesting because in the NBN, in extreme growth, I cannot underestimate the amount of growth. We doubled and doubled and doubled every 6 months. The scale ramp up was just phenomenal. I've never lived through anything like it. that put unbelievable pressure into the OSS and BSS. And they could never keep up. And so then they became the governor for the business's ability to grow.
Oh, the bottleneck, effectively.
Yeah, and there was a whole bunch of everyone pointing around wanting it to be someone else's fault, essentially, when the pressure's seriously on and you have to meet the targets anyway. But I found that it kind of dictated what people could do because it is that connector between the people and the network. Now, the network, God bless us, I'm so proud of the fact that last year in COVID, they hit the 2025 projected traffic loads and the network works. It didn't break. We were able, it had this inherent scalability and functionality to deal with that. Yet from a business perspective, when the business is growing, because it's all of the people and the way they like to do things and, grab bags of processes that either didn't connect or weren't great, there was so much noise, confusion and complexity in all of that area that it's just a really difficult thing to get right. And this to me leads into a sort of slightly different area of discussion, which is more that whether people are detail up or big picture. And telco generally has people who are detail up.
Yeah, I'm the opposite.
And I'm the opposite. And that's why we call ourselves architects, I'd suggest. So, and not everyone who calls himself an architect is that big picture person either. But what happens is under pressure, then people who are comfortable with detail hardwire all that detail in. And I think that some of that happened too much. For all the right reasons. I'm not saying anyone did anything wrong, but then that then creates an OSS kind of heritage, which wouldn't be that different in Telstra, where there's these things that have been put in place that were made to work, but it's all kind of domino-ish and becomes then hard to shift beyond that or move through that or evolve that technology stack. So I think it's problematic, that balance between detail and abstraction within, in particular, in the OSS stack.
Yeah, it's a really good point too, I think, because that tends to proliferate in terms of customizations away from perhaps the core product. And as soon as you customize, you're leading yourself down a path of tech debt. That many of the big telcos have got so much tech debt that they can't do a version upgrade. Definitely see that in many cases, particularly the tier ones who want to do that.
That's right, because they demand their particular customizations and then pay for them forever. It's kind of interesting.
And you also touched on the fact that NBN had met its 2025 volume targets, but what was even more impressive for me through COVID was the complete shift in traffic pattern as well, towards the edge of everybody now being in the homes rather than in corporate offices. That changed the traffic profile that the network was designed for, and yet it still coped.
Yeah, so generally, this is access networks. So access networks are quite sparse. So you'd expect 18% utilisation of the potential capacity in in the last mile kind of access component.
And that's busy hour you're talking there.
And it's busy hour, which is now busy 4 hours, whenever the kids get home from school to when people stop streaming. So what happened in COVID was really it just evened it out during the day more. So you still had busy hours, but it just didn't drop away in the in-between time. So that 18% utilisation would have shifted up significantly. I haven't caught it from anyone, roughly what that average in the end would have been, but it would have been quite different. So that's where the capacity is easily, and it's always a trade-off from a network capacity management perspective. How much of a peak do you cater for in your network itself?
And to come back a little bit to the perspective of the senior management around OSS and BSS, so not just necessarily NBN's perspective, but generically what you've seen across industry, I'd love to get your perspectives on the way people perceive it from the investment perspective. So many people see OSS, BSS as a cost center, that they deliver just an intangible benefit. How did you perceive it in the upper echelons of the businesses that you dealt with, that investment decision around OSS, BSS?
Yeah, look, it was really, really interesting. it's hard for me not to think of my NBN experience, so I'll try and pull it up a little bit from that perspective. To me, it's where you need to build in your ability to meet your KPIs, whatever part of the business you're in, all right? So if you're in marketing, you need to be able to understand what the leads are and how the sales are going. If you're in network management and network assurance, you need to know what the fault rates are against, your overall availability targets or those sorts of things. So it is the tool set that you need to have in place to have the right visibility and control over your function such that you can meet your goals. That said, it usually also isn't ever quite what you need. And, God knows what drives that sort of mismatch, but there's always a mismatch between what people want from OSS and what they're getting. I'm sure that's the bane of every IT manager and CIO. That whole people not knowing what they want or not being able to describe it adequately, because it is that human interface component versus, what can be delivered from an IT system with the current technology or the current constraints that it has.
And I guess everybody's perspective on it is so vastly different as well, that managing up, managing down, managing sidewards, which you would have had to do in those roles. Did your messaging or language around these tools really change much between the different people you were dealing with?
I think the big challenge was when you've invested in something that perhaps isn't the right direction. And it's knowing if you can still pull out and if that's actually what you want to do, because you're going to take a delay and a hit in whatever you're trying to achieve. I had a very difficult situation around a workforce management sort of solution, but that was so tied up in the way that everybody thought you should be engaging the subcontracted workforces and whether they should have stuff on their side or not, or blah, blah, blah. And so the OSS is a point of truth because you have to implement it one way or the other, right? But those debates are constant in a business like that, because there's never a way to do things. There is never a best solution. There are going to be pros and cons with anything you do.
And like any startup, you make decisions and then realise that's not quite the right one. You have to fall back on that and move towards something else. But in a politically charged situation, it would have been even exacerbated at somewhere like NBN.
Yeah, true. Yeah, I mean, the whole Senate Estimates Committee every month, it was an incredible pressure point. As one person who had to front up on it used to say, it's like having an exam but not knowing what the subject is. You can't have to be ready for anything,
Sounds like my uni experience as well, showing up to exams not knowing what the subject was about. So is there anything that maybe people at the coalface might be shocked about in terms of the way executives perceive OSS, BSS? You talked a little bit about the very detailed engineering perspective, and I very much see these tools as a means to an end, but many of my counterparts, this is the be-all and end-all. It's all about these operational tools, not the outcomes they deliver. But yeah, any perspectives that you would have around the coalface being shocked as the difference of opinions that execs may have?
I'm not so sure of that. I think where there is executives that are not technically literate, that the whole point is actual trust between the IT client managers or the people who actually do the interfacing with the business. So I think they might underestimate the fact that there is, in situations of trust or distrust, you get really, really different outcomes. And I think that that's at least as important as the coolness of the IT tool that they, that they live and breathe with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm really, really data driven, and that's perhaps one of the reasons why I am so into these tools as I am. Did you gain perhaps even more of an appreciation of the data when you were in the EGM of network ops, or have you, I guess, always had that awareness of what these tools can gather and the insights to derive?
Yeah, look, I'm a technical person, so I'm not the right person to ask as an EGM, to be honest. The trick in all of this is always collecting the right data or presenting the right data and getting, choosing what you're actually going to watch, what you want on your dashboard, and why is it important, and is it really a lead or lag indicator? So I think people want a lot out of data these days, but I think it's an area where it would be really great if there was a lot more business coaching on actually how to structure up what it is you want, such that then, because the data is the data, and you need to have people with the data science skills to make sure that what number they present is actually a valid number, and it's not just they've used an inappropriate algorithm on dodgy data or whatever. You've really got to have people who are hot to trot on that to make sure that the numbers you get are accurate. But that said, you've still got to figure out what's the most important data that's going to make your business decisions on. And that I'd love to see more courses around actually business decision structuring for big data, rather than just have people saying, yeah, we need data scientists.
Funnily enough, that's one of my side projects at the moment, Carolyn. So thank you for pointing that one out.
I'm publicising it for you. Here we go. Choose Ryan's project. Yeah.
I hadn't even made anyone aware of it yet. It's interesting stuff. And did you have much of an involvement in setting up those early dashboards in that role?
No, look, I had roughly a year in that operations role, and a lot of it was really just transforming the workforce to be able to cope with the onslaught of the multi-technology mix. And so what people measured, I think they got a lot more sophisticated after my time there.
Yeah, sure. So I get a bit more about the role today too. So we've been lucky enough to work together on some really interesting consulting projects through AT Kearney, or now just Kearney. I've really loved those assignments and getting the chance to work with the great team that they have there. You have your own brand as a leading broadband strategist. Do you like being able to work with some of those bigger brands and the bigger teams, as well as being able to build your own brand?
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, I'm a team player, so for me, working with others is what it's all about. I don't want to just work on my own. So I learn from everyone I'm with, and that's sort of one of the more important things for me to always feel that I'm continually learning. So I am really impressed with the way that the Kearney people, they get a lot of complex data and they synthesize it incredibly well. And they also structure a discussion or an argument and a proposal or a recommendation in a really, really sound way. And that is a tremendously good skill, because a lot of technical background people just want to go blur, here's the technical stuff, whereas they are always coming from the business perspective. And I have a lot of alignment with that, because I've always felt from a network side how integral it is to the business. I've always felt aligned with that whole business perspective.
And maybe, again, that's that big picture perspective that as consultants, I guess that's the direction we tend to come from, that it's a different perspective. I think it's quite valuable, but I think, as you talked about earlier, there's the need for both.
There is, yeah.
The need for those really, really detailed people as well. And so do you work predominantly in collaborations these days? And maybe perhaps also explain some of the types of projects, partners and customers that would be a great mutual fit for you.
Yeah, look, I mean, my experience is broad and deep in access networks for telco. So I am very much able to, and I've applied my skills in multiple countries. So I'm able to genericise but also tailor solutions to the local conditions. And I think that's really, really important. I don't have the answer that I'm trying to push through whatever situation. It's quite the opposite.
The agnostic coming in position, perhaps, on assignments.
Look, and I guess the other thing I like is to have things that will last, so that there's some inherent sustainability of a solution, right? So I'm not trying to find any answer. I want one that's going to be even better in a year's time or 2 years' time. Do you know what I mean? Like it's actually that gives me the most satisfaction if I can apply my mind to those sorts of things where the fruits grow after you've put it in place.
And I know you're really passionate about networks and also some of the bleeding edge tech. Are there any particular technologies or products or concepts that we should really have on our radar, that we should be using already, or we should be starting to play with, or hold great promise in the future, do you think?
Look, it's a funny, I'll give you a funny answer to that one, considering it's an OSS BSS audience. For me, it's the medium is the thing that lasts for 100 years. So what I would say is that, fibre and therefore photonics in a processing sort of sense, those sorts of directions are ones that are going to absolutely last. Software and languages and all those sorts of things will continue to evolve, and you'll have the brand new one that's so much better than the old ones, except it's just a bit different, really. And I think there'll continue to be this concertina push and pull between structured software, business analysis and system engineering, and agile methodology, which is to trial. But I think it'll be interesting to see how sustainability starts to work its way through the tech stack. If we think of Bitcoin using more power than Austria, which was some time ago, so I'm sure it's probably, surpassed that, and it's probably America half of now. Europe. Yeah. Where does that sustainability come into it? Really, we keep saying big data, but come on. We owe it to the earth to make sure that it's not going to, that the technology is going to be able to be sustainable. Because if it's not sustainable, it won't last either.
Yeah, a really valid point. Almost the granification of telco networks as well, that they have been incredibly power-hungry networks in the data centres. Yep. And yet I still wonder whether there are some organisations that are really looking at it from the perspective of just buy carbon credits and say that we're carbon neutral, as opposed to really
doing
looking
stuff.
at that next frontier of telco engineering really being the greening of the network.
Yeah, I think that's the one I would be interested in pursuing ideas around more.
Yeah, fascinating. Really fascinating. We've covered a lot of areas today, Carolyn. Is there anything else? Any other insights that I haven't really asked the question the right way? Anything else to get out to all of those OSS and BSS practitioners out there about maybe it's the pitfalls, maybe it's how we could be doing things differently with maybe a networker's hat or an EGM's hat on? Perhaps there's other ways or other insights that we should have when thinking about our projects.
It's really important to keep flexibility and an open mind, and respecting different disciplines. I've seen the best things happen when you've got people with disparate positions and skills actually coming together and taking the time to get consensus that is, and work through things together. I don't think that technology development has to be competitive in a knockdown, punch out kind of way. I've seen far too much of that, and it bruises people, and it really doesn't necessarily it gets the loudest voice heard. It doesn't get the best solution. So I would encourage people to kind of create the environments that they want to work in, of being able to understand different points of view. And innovation is where you take something that's previously known and apply it to a brand new situation. And that's optical fibre is made in the same way. The actual cables, it's super high-tech stuff, but it tends to be in places where they used to make ship ropes and things, because a lot of the fibre-making technologies are, cable-making technologies are the same as doing ships for, the old sailing ships that used to go around the world. Optical fibre, they use gravity to start the core, it's the gob, as they call it, drops down, so there's all sorts of ways of innovating and getting amazing things happen. It's about keeping that flexibility of input and an open mind, and be curious.
That part's really fascinating. So I did optical engineering at uni and never realised the tie-in to the cable making industry. So that's a new one for me. That's great. And interestingly enough, I've found that often the worst work environments to work within over the years I've also noticed the correlation that it tends to be all men, and often the ego of the intellectual might and the chest beating that goes on in those all-male projects. That clearly, to me, not just the diversity of women and their thoughts, but just diversity in general of thinking has been really obvious to me over the many years of working in different teams. So it's a really key call out there, I think, as well. So it's been a fascinating journey. I've loved having the chat today with you, Carolyn. Where would people find you if they wanted to continue the conversation and perhaps have you on as their broadband strategist?
Well, you can always find me on LinkedIn, and my email is carolynphiddian@gmail.com. That's carolynphiddian@gmail.com. I'm very happy to take an email and see where it goes.
Fantastic. And once again, really appreciated your thoughts. Thanks for being on as a guest today, Carolyn.
Thanks very much, Ryan. It's been a pleasure, and thank you for having me.
And thank you also for the audience, and I look forward to getting another episode out to you shortly. Thanks for listening to the Passionate About OSS podcast. You can find more episodes, more than 2,500 blogs, and our contact details over at passionateaboutoss.com.